She was standing next to my car before I even had the door open. I'd just finished a double shift at the grocery store. Bag boy, 63 years old. Don't let anyone tell you pride doesn't have a price. And I was so tired my hands were shaking a little when I reached for my keys. It was raining, one of those thin November rains that gets inside your collar no matter what you do. And the parking lot was mostly empty except for a few carts someone hadn't bothered to return. She was maybe 70. Small woman. White hair pulled back tight. She had a wool coat on, the kind you don't see much anymore, dark green, with the buttons done all the way up to the throat, and she was just standing there beside my car, looking at me like she recognized me from somewhere and couldn't quite place it. I thought I'd parked too close to hers. I started to apologize. She said, "Are you Harlan? Harlan Pruitt?" I stopped. Nobody's called me by that name in a long time. Most people around here know me as just Harlan. But Pruitt, my father's name, my name before everything, that stopped me cold. I said yes. She started to cry. Not dramatically, not the way people cry in movies. It was quiet, just her eyes filling up and her chin doing that thing where it trembles and you can tell the person is fighting it and losing. She pressed one hand to her mouth and looked at me like I was something she'd been searching for in a drawer for 30 years and had finally found. I didn't know what to do. I asked her if she was all right. Stupid thing to say. Clearly she wasn't all right. She said, "Your father. You look exactly like your father." My father's name was Douglas Pruitt. I want to say that clearly because this whole story is really about him, not me. I'm just the one who happened to be standing in a parking lot in the rain. He died when I was 41. Prostate cancer, caught too late. He was a quiet man, the kind people call steady. He worked maintenance at a textile plant outside Danville for 31 years. He drove a truck that needed the window rolled down to stay latched. He kept his dress shoes in a paper bag in the closet so they wouldn't get dusty, because he only wore them to church and to funerals. He didn't talk much about himself. He didn't talk much about anything, really. He was just there, solid as a fence post, and I didn't understand until he was gone how much of my life had been built leaning against him. After he died, I found out I didn't know him as well as I thought. That's the thing about quiet men. There's a lot of room inside that silence. My wife passed 14 months before that night in the parking lot. 40 years we were married. Breast cancer. She went fast, which people kept telling me was a mercy, and I kept nodding and not saying what I actually thought, which was that fast didn't feel like a mercy from where I was standing. Fast meant I didn't have enough time to memorize her voice. Fast meant some mornings I'd roll over still half asleep, and the bed would be empty and I'd have to figure it out all over again. After she was gone, my son and my daughter sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten 10,000 meals, where I'd helped them with homework, where my wife used to do her crosswords in the morning. And they explained to me, in very reasonable voices, that the house was more than I could manage alone. They weren't wrong about that, technically. The gutters needed work. The furnace was old. My daughter had already been on the phone with a real estate agent, she said, just to understand the market, just so we'd have information. I sat there looking at the surface of that table, and I thought about all the years worked into that wood, all the Sunday dinners and birthday cakes, and arguments that ended with everyone apologizing before bed. And then I thought about how my children were sitting across from me using the word "we" to mean a decision they'd already made. I moved into a studio apartment 2 months later, 600 square feet. The walls were beige. The window looked out at a dumpster. My daughter helped me pick out a shower curtain. I didn't say anything about any of it, because I was 62 years old, and I still believed, back then, that not making trouble was a kind of love. I got the job at the grocery store because I needed something to do with my hands. The retirement was enough to cover the rent, but not enough to cover the silence. I'd worked physical jobs my whole life, warehouse and loading dock, and a stint doing grounds maintenance at a golf course I could never have afforded to play. Scanning barcodes and carrying groceries to cars wasn't hard. It kept me from sitting in that apartment thinking about the yellow kitchen in the house I didn't live in anymore. That was my life when this woman found me in the parking lot. Her name was Rosemary. Her late husband's name was Frank. They'd run a small machine shop together for decades, precision parts, industrial contracts, the kind of business that doesn't show up in any magazine but keeps the country running. She said she'd been looking for me, or really for my father, for almost 40 years. I said I didn't understand. She said, "Can we sit somewhere?" I don't. I'd rather not do this in the rain. We went to a diner 2 blocks over. She ordered coffee. Her hands were steady now, just that small redness around her eyes. She had the manner of a woman who had said hard things before and knew how to gather herself. She told me the story while the rain hit the diner windows and the cook called out orders in the back. In 1987, Frank's shop was going under. They'd taken on a big contract, ordered the equipment to fulfill it, and then the client had folded. Just gone, bankrupt overnight, taking every payment they were owed down with it. Frank had loans out. They had 3 kids. They were 4 months from losing everything. My father was working a second job then, weekend maintenance at the industrial park where Frank's shop was located. Frank knew him the way you know someone you see every week for years. Not close, not family, but solid acquaintance. A man you'd nod to. A man you knew the name of. One Saturday morning, Frank was sitting outside the shop on an overturned crate, head in his hands. My father walked by, stopped, asked what was wrong. Frank told him, not because he meant to. Just because my father asked, and there was something about the way he asked, patient and without any edge to it, that made you answer. My father didn't say much. He went home. 2 days later, he came back to the shop and found Frank and set a bank envelope on his workbench. $11,000. Frank asked where it came from. My father said it was savings. Frank said he couldn't take it. My father said he wasn't offering a gift. He was offering a loan. And the only condition was that Frank paid it back when he was able, no schedule, no interest, and didn't mention it to anyone because my father didn't want the attention. Frank said, "I can't take a man's savings." My father said, "Then borrow it. There's a difference." I sat in that diner booth and I thought about my father driving a truck with a window that had to be held shut with your shoulder. I thought about the paper bag with the dress shoes in it. $11,000 in 1987. I didn't say anything for a while. Rosemary let me sit with it. She didn't try to fill the space, which I appreciated. Finally, I said, "He never told me." She said, "We know. We didn't know how to find him for years. We moved, changed our address twice. We tried looking, but Douglas Pruitt isn't an uncommon name, and the internet wasn't. It wasn't like now. Frank hired someone to try, an investigator years later, but they couldn't locate him. Your father had moved too, your family had." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "When Frank got sick, 3 years ago, he made me promise. He said, 'Rosemary, you find that man's family.' He had a piece of paper he'd kept in his desk drawer for 40 years. He'd written your father's name on it, just the name and what he'd done. He said if he couldn't find Douglas, then whoever came from Douglas deserved to know what kind of man their father was." I said, "How did you find me?" She said she'd hired someone good this time, that it took almost a year, and had led through 3 dead ends before they found my address, and then she'd found out where I worked, and she'd been trying to work up the nerve to approach me for 3 weeks. She opened her purse. She took out an envelope. She slid it across the table. She said, "The shop is worth something now. After Frank passed, I talked to our kids. We all agreed. Whatever your father loaned us, we figured out what it would be worth if it had grown with the business. We talked to our accountant. We came to a number." I opened the envelope. I don't want to say the specific amount. It was more than I expected, more than I could put into words sitting in that diner booth with rain on the windows and a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. I said I couldn't accept it. She said that was almost word for word what Frank had said to my father, and could I see how that was going to go for me? I didn't cash the check that week. I put it in a drawer and I went about my life and I thought about it every single day. I thought about my father, the way he'd go quiet at dinner sometimes, looking at something past the wall, somewhere the rest of us couldn't see. I used to think he was just tired. I thought about his second job on weekends, the one he'd taken to help with my sister's orthodontist bills he'd told us. Maybe that was part of it, maybe not all of it. I thought about my son, who called me on my birthday and at Christmas, and occasionally for other reasons, but who had not once in 14 months since his mother died, come to that apartment and sat with me for an afternoon. Not once. I thought about my daughter, who had been very efficient about the house. I thought about what I wanted my life to be for whatever years I had left in it. On the 3rd week, I called my son. I told him what had happened. I told him about Rosemary and Frank and the envelope. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that was incredible, that was really something, and he asked how much. I told him. He was quiet again. Different kind of quiet. He said, "Dad, you know that really should be shared with the family. Granddad was our family too. We all lost him." I said, "I know." He said, "I mean, rightfully speaking, me and your daughter." I said, "I know what you're going to say." He said, "I'm just saying it's a family situation." I said, "Your grandfather gave that money when I was 16 years old. He never told me. He never told your grandmother. He never asked for anything back, and he didn't tell a single person. And he went to his grave the same quiet way he'd lived. And I've been sitting here 3 weeks thinking about what that means." My son said he just thought we should discuss it as a family. I said, "There's nothing to discuss." I don't think he understood what I meant by that right then. That's all right. I wasn't saying it for him. I called my daughter the next day. It went much the same way. She said she wasn't trying to make it about money. It was just that, "Dad, you're 63, you're working a grocery store job. You should think about your security. Let us help you figure this out." The us again. The efficient us. I said I was thinking about my security just fine. She said, "I'm just worried about you making a decision without." I said, "Sweetheart, your grandfather spent 40 years not making a fuss about the best thing he ever did. I think I can manage one decision without a committee." I went back to Rosemary. We had coffee again, same diner. She brought her youngest son this time, a man about my daughter's age, who shook my hand with both of his and looked like he might also start crying, which I was starting to understand was just how their family was, and I found I didn't mind it. I told her I was going to accept the money. I told her what I'd decided to do with most of it. My father was a maintenance man his whole life. He fixed the things that broke, heating systems, plumbing, equipment that wore out. He believed, I think, that keeping things running was a kind of dignity, that there was honor in making sure the lights stayed on for other people even when nobody was watching. In the town where I grew up, there's a community center that runs programs for elderly residents who can't afford home repairs. They help people stay in their homes. They fix the things that break. They do exactly what my father spent his life doing, and they've been running short for years. I made a donation large enough to fund their repair program for 5 years. I asked that it be made in my father's name. I kept enough to pay off my apartment for a year and fix my own truck, which needs the front suspension looked at and has for a while. Maybe I'll find a better place to live. Maybe I'll take a trip somewhere, see something I haven't seen. My wife always wanted to go to Nova Scotia. I used to say maybe next year. There's a ferry you can take. I looked it up. My son called me a month later. He said he'd been thinking about it and he was sorry for how the conversation had gone. He said he understood now. I appreciated that. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and I'm 63 years old, and I have learned that something is worth more than people give it credit for. My daughter sent a card, handwritten. She said she was proud of me, and she thought Granddad would have been proud too. She's not wrong about that second part. I believe that with everything I have, but here's what I think about. Late at night, when the apartment is quiet and the heater ticks, and I'm almost asleep. My father fixed a stranger's problem in 1987 and went home and never mentioned it. He wasn't looking for a reward. He wasn't building a legacy. He was just a man who saw someone sitting on a crate with his head in his hands and thought he might be able to help. That's it. That's the whole thing. And 40 years later, in a parking lot in the rain, a woman in a green wool coat found his son and said, "Your father was a good man. We wanted you to know." I didn't always know how much I needed to hear that. I know now.